Today we're continuing to look at some of the interesting and I think really inspiring ideas that we find in a new book that came out in February called Enlightenment Now: The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress by Steven Pinker. Reason, science, humanism, progress, those are called the core values of a historical period known as the Enlightenment, which started, depending on who you ask, sometime in the mid-1700s thereabouts. And most of the time when we hear the word enlightenment, it's being used in reference to the Buddha, which, by the way, wasn't his name. The historical Buddha was actually a guy named Siddhartha. Buddha is a descriptive title which literally means awakened one. Siddhartha denied that he was anything special or had some kind of special superpower or super intellect. He simply said, "I am awake." Hence the awakened one. And similarly, I think, to the way we talk about the Buddha being enlightened or awakened, the historical Enlightenment was also a time of awakening. It was a time of awakening for the Western world. It was a time of liberation where people escaped the bondage of authoritarian religions which didn't allow people to think for themselves. They replaced superstition and authority with reason and the scientific method. And that was a big deal, because when human beings finally embraced this newfound freedom and these new values, the discoveries that followed changed the world forever. Things like steam power, electricity, germ theory, antibiotics, the theory of evolution, and even new forms of government. The USA is a product of the Enlightenment. Unity is a product of Enlightenment thinking. And traditional religions, well, they've never really fully come to terms with the Enlightenment. And some of them are still waging a battle. Some of them are still fighting, for instance, evolution, tooth and nail. Nope, 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 none of that human reason stuff. Don't trust human reason based on observation and experiments. Instead, trust this really old book called the Bible. Now don't get me wrong, the Bible still has an important place, I think, in our culture. But I remember something that Karen used to talk about when we were studying back at Unity Institute. Actually, it was more of a question, really, and it was an important question about the Bible. She said, how is it that a collection of stories from Bronze and Iron Age people thousands of years ago, from a culture different from ours, on the opposite side of the world, who spoke languages that are basically dead today, how did that book become so influential and dominant on this side of the world? It's a really good question. That's quite an accomplishment, isn't it, when you think about it? It took centuries for Western culture to finally decide that it was time to move on and develop a worldview that was based on human knowledge of the world today, not 2,000 plus years ago. In many really important ways, the values of the Enlightenment belong to us in a far more profound way than the values of the Bible. They arise from a culture which is much closer to us in language and all sorts of other things. And if there's any doubt about that, go to the Bible and try reading Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and take a look at some of the ideas and values that are contained in there. If we still operated according to biblical morality, here's a few things that we'd have to deal with. Check this out. Now, you could still own slaves. You could own male and female slaves, provided that you get them from Canada and Mexico, I guess is what they're saying there. Because it says your slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. That's Leviticus. Here's another one. Now, if you run short of money and you happen to have an extra daughter, sell her into slavery. Sell her into slavery. And the reason that they specify a daughter here is because the daughter does not get set free in the same way that a male slave would be. Once the daughter is sold into slavery, you don't have to deal with her again. That's Exodus. All right. A couple more examples. Executioners. We would really have a need for executioners. Just for working on the Sabbath you were to be put to death. But I will tell you that the list is longer than my arm of all the different crazy things that you could be put to death for, by stoning usually, back in the Old Testament. That's more from Exodus. Barbers. Well, we could do away with barbers probably, because guys aren't supposed to trim the hair on their temples or trim their beards or anything else. That's Leviticus. And tattoo parlors would definitely go out of business. You shall not make any cuts on your body for the dead or tattoo yourselves. I am the Lord. I'll tell you, the one that cracks me up is that occasionally I'll see a person with a big tattoo on their arm or their leg that says that homosexuality is an abomination, and they cite Leviticus. They've apparently never seen that one, that tattooing yourself is an abomination. It would be a mess. And I could go on at length with more strange stuff from the Bible that would make you... Well, anyway, I'm just scratching the surface. You get the idea. So we discovered the Enlightenment was about humankind discovering that we could do better than that, and we did. Today we look at the Enlightenment value of reason, and we touched on it last week when we talked about how Unity co-founder Charles Fillmore was a big proponent of reason and logic. Now, back in the 1800s, Unity was part of a larger group. You've probably heard the term New Thought. That was the name of this larger movement that Unity was a part of. The label New Thought started showing up in the 1890s. It was a substitute for other labels that were used. One example is mental science or science of mind and things like that. They all came under this new label of New Thought. And the new in New Thought was in contrast to old forms of thinking found in traditional religion. That was the first point of departure. And by the way, if you're really interested in getting the whole story of the development of New Thought in detail, there's a book. I think I got a picture of the cover here. Yeah, the book is called Spirits in Rebellion, The Rise and Development of New Thought by Charles S. Braden. The book's out of print, but you can pretty easily find a used copy somewhere, one of those used book outfits online. So, the core idea behind New Thought was this radical notion that you could change the way you feel by changing the way you think. In Unity, we often hear this idea referred to as the law of mind action. And the shorthand way of saying it, which we use here, is thoughts held in mind tend to produce after their own kind. So, this idea was starting to become popular in the mid-1800s. 150 years later, it's kind of hard to call it new, right? But we still hear the label, right? New Thought. Which again brings up the question, what was it about the law of mind action in particular that was so new back in the 1800s? Well, here's a little background. Before New Thought came around, pretty much everyone believed that mind and matter were two separate things that operated according to two different and separate sets of rules. Whatever was made of matter couldn't think, and mind cannot extend into the realm of matter. If you're really into history and philosophy, the philosophical name for this way of looking at reality is called substance dualism. It originates historically with this guy here, the French philosopher and mathematician René Descartes, back in the 1600s. And that's the way things went bumping around for 150 years or so until this thing called the Enlightenment happened. Enlightenment ideas opened the door to the possibility that mind and matter may not be two separate things after all, and maybe our thoughts have a lot more to do with our physical experiences and feelings than we realized. And incidentally, as you might imagine, this would have also been the birth of modern psychology, which makes sense. New Thought was new because it recognized a new level of importance when it comes to our thought process. if the way we think is so important, then we should go about thinking in an intentional, aware, disciplined, orderly, and logical fashion. That's what reason means. It's the power of comprehending, inferring, thinking in orderly, rational ways. Another definition that I saw of reason was the proper exercise of mind. The proper exercise of mind, which takes us back to the law of mind action. The proper exercise of mind, thoughts held in mind, tend to produce after their own kind. So make sure that we're proceeding carefully, intentionally, and in an orderly and rational fashion. Remember what Charles Fillmore had to say about thought and the power of thinking. These two really important quotes here. He said, "Humankind is the power of God in action. To humankind is given the highest power in the universe, conscious power of thought." And he also said, "The thinking faculty in humankind makes each person a free agent because it is our creative center. In and through this one power, we establish our consciousness, we build our world." Going back to that first one there, how does it feel to think of yourself as the power of God in action? How does it feel to know that it is our thinking faculty that sets us free and builds our world? Something we have to work at. It's important, and in case you haven't noticed, we aren't always in perfect control of our thoughts, are we? Anyone here ever have a negative thought? Happens a lot more than we want to admit, right? Human beings, we have evolved, unique among other species on this planet. We've evolved to be able to think logically and rationally, and we are still vulnerable to illusions and fallacies. That's why I love this quote from the renowned physicist Richard Feynman. He said that the first rule of science is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. That really sums up the kind of humility that ought to be, and I think really is involved in the scientific method and reason. Rational thought and the scientific method go hand in hand with humility, because guaranteed, at some point they are going to bring you up face to face, nose to nose, with that human tendency to believe in stuff without adequate evidence or to be fooled. So we have to be wary, and if it happens, then we just have to resolve to do better next time. Be willing to change our mind as new evidence comes to light. That can be a little bit of a challenge, though. That kind of humility can be a little bit of a challenge, especially after listening to Charles Fillmore getting us all puffed up about being the power of God in action because of our thought process. We have to hold the two in that kind of a creative tension and some kind of a balance, this idea of humility and yet still accept the reality of the power that we have within. We have to use our power of reason. We have to use the thought process itself to be aware of our shortcomings, to be aware of our biases, our prejudices, and especially our all too human tendency to retreat into tribal ideology. Not paying attention to the facts, not paying attention to the numbers, but retreating into tribal ideology, and that happens especially in the realm of politics, religion as well. I think one of the other major gifts of the Enlightenment was that it revived an interest in early classical Greek philosophy. That philosophy had been overshadowed and in some cases actually suppressed by centuries of bad theology at the hands of the church. When Charles Fillmore said that humankind is the power of God in action by virtue of the power of conscious thought, he was echoing an ancient Greek concept, which is worth remembering. The concept is logos. Logos, a Greek word that is the root of the word logic. Logos was the word that they would use to describe in ancient Greece. They would describe a rational kind of logic and order that characterized the universe. They saw this logic and order being expressed in nature. Logos was regarded by the early Greek Stoics as a form of active reason that pervades and governs what happens in the universe. That's what they thought all the way back in the 5th century when they started to realize that, and we're talking 5th century BC here, this is before the time of Socrates and Aristotle and all those people. They started to realize that all of the different natural processes that they observed around them could be explained by certain rules and certain laws that they could understand and articulate and apply in other situations. So we might say that the Logos was the sum total of those natural laws that they were coming to comprehend and apply. And they would often call it the divine Logos, because it could explain things that were once thought to be caused by the gods or the goddesses in the Greek pantheon, Zeus, Aphrodite, Apollo, and so on. At one time they thought that lightning was Zeus casting lightning bolts down to the earth, but after sufficient observation and understanding, they began to realize that lightning was really just a big burst of static electricity from the clouds to the ground, from the ground to the clouds, from cloud to cloud, all of that kind of stuff. Things that they used to have to explain by referring to gods, this god did it or that god did it, they now had natural explanations for. All of those were part of the Logos. So what happened was that eventually the Greek philosophers started to lose interest in their pantheon of gods because these gods were no longer necessary to explain the things that they could observe in the world around them. They began to lose interest in these gods, and finally we get to the time of Socrates. You know the story of Socrates, right? He was put on trial, and he was executed for the crime of impiety, not believing in the gods of the state, which is another cautionary tale about why having an official state religion is a really bad idea. Charles Fillmore equated the word logos with the creative power or principle of the universe. Here's what he said about it. He said, the law of logos is the law of divine creation. It produces the order and harmony of perfect thought. This probably explains what he meant when he said that humankind is the power of God in action by virtue of the power of conscious thought. Maybe a better way of saying it is that humankind is the Logos in action. And our ability to observe and to understand the operation of Logos is all the proof we need of that. We can understand the logic and order of Logos in the way that the universe operates and unfolds because we're one of the end products of that unfolding. It produces us, it's operating in us and as us, and so we can comprehend how it works in the world around us. We're one of the end products of the unfolding of the Logos. Maybe not the ultimate, but we partake in the very nature of Logos because human consciousness is capable of seeing it and explaining how it works. And that doesn't mean that we have the whole story yet. Got to get that humility back into play here. We don't know the whole story yet. We cannot see yet, much less comprehend what there was before the Big Bang and how it operated. And it's okay to say, I don't know. But we do have a really good understanding of how the universe went from Big Bang to hydrogen to the building blocks of life, and then to life and consciousness itself. And yet for some folks, well, they still insist that it was all done by a guy who looks like, I don't know, did I get some pictures up here? Yeah. They still insist that it was all done by a guy, and it's always a guy, isn't it? At least in our culture, who looks something like this. And you know what, if that's where they're at, okay. But for anyone who might be looking for another way to express the meaning of the word God, I highly recommend the concept of logos, which I think is an elegant and poetic way of capturing the reason and the order that we see giving rise to everything we know of in the universe, which is yet another gift of the Enlightenment. Now, I haven't even touched on how one of the Gospels use the word logos in talking about the birth of Jesus. And we're out of time for today, so that will have to be where we will pick up again in 2 weeks after our Lake Tahoe retreat next weekend. And if you're not going to be with us in Tahoe, Reverend Rick will be speaking, so please come back next week, and then the week after that, and the week after that. Make it a habit. We'd love to see you. Thank you.